Aloha everyone, and thank you for joining the COVID-19 Public Health Action webinar, Shaping a Just Future, How Hawaii's Youth Are Leading During COVID-19 and Beyond. My name is Steph Moyer, and I'm the Community Initiatives and Training Coordinator for the Hawaii Public Health Institute. Before we get started, I just want to go over some Zoom housekeeping with you. For all questions, please utilize the chat box or questions and answers box located at the bottom of your screen. We are not offering any continuing education credits for our COVID webinar series. And lastly, all webinars are recorded and will be available on the Hawaii Public Health Training Hui's YouTube channel. It's my honor to introduce you to our guest moderator for today, Joshua Ching. Josh is a 16-year-old rising junior at Kamehameha Schools Kapalama. He is a youth leader in the movement to ban all flavored tobacco products and currently serves on the leadership team for the Coalition for Tobacco-Free Hawaii's Youth Council. This summer, Joshua is working to establish a youth advocacy and civic engagement club for his school. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Josh.
All right, thanks, Stephanie, for that introduction. It is my honor to introduce the next three panelists that will also be sharing their journey and their story about being youth advocates here in Hawaii. So I will be first introducing Nikkya Taliaferro, a rising senior at Moanalua High School, and is the executive director of Hawaii for Black Lives, a teen advocacy group protesting against racial injustice. She hopes to encourage more teens to get involved with the advocacy and social justice initiatives in their community. Next, I'll be introducing Kawika Pegram, an 18-year-old who is a class of 2022 graduate at Waipahu High School. He is currently the executive director for the Hawaii Youth Climate Coalition. In this position, he's played a key part in mobilizing thousands of people to take action on the climate crisis. He's an advocate for social equity, climate action, and civil rights. When he's not advocating for causes he's passionate about, he is hanging out with his friends and taking mediocre photos of Hawaii's beautiful surroundings. Last but not least is Joseph Newmann, a 20-year-old student studying at Seattle University. This summer, Joseph is advocating for Resolution 19-329, which would establish a youth commission for the city and county of Honolulu. He is also an intern at Blue Zones Project Hawaii. So mahalo for having me on as the moderator for this webinar. I'm so honored to share this panel with three amazing advocates of our generation from right here in the community. Youth advocacy is one of the most important aspects of our society, especially in times as pressing and divisive as these. The fight for amelioration, for reform, for a better world from youth is inspiring and truly transformative. Which leads me to the first question, which I will be directing to Nikkya. So I know that you've been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and were one of the organizers of the peaceful protests that occurred here in Honolulu. In terms of that social justice initiative, what inspired you and how did you get involved in your cause?
So I was inspired basically by my friends. I never grew up in a family that was politically active, but I did have friends who were within humanitarian issues and political issues, not necessarily here in Honolulu, but in previous places that I've lived. And they really pushed me to find my own passions and what I believed in and what I wanted to fight for within a community. And specifically for Hawaii for Black Lives, I was actually reached out to by my friend Amelia, because I had done previous just hosting events, not necessarily political, within the Boys and Girls Club of America. And they reached out to me and said, asked me if I wanted to host help host the event that was happening a couple of weekends ago. And I realized that that was my opportunity to really step into my community and do something that I've been passionate about since middle school and really fight for something I believed in. I was completely aware that there were problems that needed to be fixed here in Honolulu, and that was my opportunity to.
Awesome. So let's turn the same question over to Kawika in terms of your involvement in the environmental justice movement to curb climate change. So what inspired you and how did you get involved in your cause?
Yeah, so thinking about climate change specifically, I was raised in the Philippines. I was born here in Hawaii, but I spent about 8 years in the Philippines from when I was 5 to older. And when I was growing up, there was a big typhoon called Typhoon Ondoy This typhoon had killed maybe 500 or 600 people, but that statistic necessarily wasn't distressing to me, because that was just the kind of normal effects of typhoons, and that's what I was used to. The hard part about the rain was the realization that I would have to go to school the next day in floodwater. And that's kind of where you get this idea about, you know, in richer communities, whether it's here in America or whether it's richer communities in the Philippines, and poorer communities, there's one that suffers significantly more in terms of the effects of climate change. And growing up, that had always been something at the back of my mind. And when I was scrolling through Twitter, much like I do every Sunday night, and much like the president does as well, I saw this tweet from David Hogg, who had organized the March for Our Lives protest, and you know, he brought up a really good point of, you know, if we're going out of school striking because, you know, kids are being killed by gun violence, why aren't we doing the same thing to climate change? That's killing just as many, if not more. And so I decided to reach out to an organization that I knew was organizing one the next month, and within 2 hours, I was the state lead for that organization, and we had put on, ever since then, a handful of protests and other community events, and that's kind of how I got my bearings within this space.
Yeah, that's awesome. Finally, let's send this over to Joseph and your efforts to establish a youth commission for the city and county of Honolulu. What inspired you, and how did you get involved in your cause?
Well, before I begin to answer this, I just want to explain the effort I'm working on, Resolution 19-329, which would basically initiate amendments to the revised City and County of Honolulu Charter to the creation of a youth commission, which would basically be a political body within our city government of youth members aged 14 to 24 who will advise the mayor on actual policies and legislation. It's a really great movement that we're working towards. And what has inspired me really are these youth leaders that have been becoming more and more prevalent, not only in the nation, but also here in Hawaii with Kawika, you yourself, Josh, and with Nikkya. I think of the San Francisco Youth Commission, who they're not just commissioners, they're also community leaders. They're helping head the allocation of the COVID-19 response budget. They are creating the Vote 16 measure, which would reduce the voting age in San Francisco, a city of almost 1 million people, to 16 and 17-year-olds. And it's just realizing that youth are becoming more and more engaged in our civic and legislative process, really. And not just that, is they're geared with the capacity to create real change. I think of locally, we have Teani Mautera, who became the youngest ever member to join an Oahu neighborhood board in Hawaii Kai. Recognizing these people and really youth leaders who want to create change and are pursuing opportunities to actually create tangible change in our communities and in our roads. And I got involved in this cause early on in the summer through Blue Zones Project. And we recognized that there were these stakeholders coming together to create a youth commission, but they weren't necessarily talking to each other. And so we assembled almost 30 plus organizations to come together and create a coalition to make this effort real. In fact, they're listening. The full council is hearing this resolution as we speak today. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. So going off of that, you know, over the past few years, as you talked about, youth activism has accumulated a greater prominence in a multitude of movements in the political sphere. A few examples being the race-related social justice initiatives and the fight against climate change and civic engagement overall. However, it's drawn some scrutiny over its relevance and effectiveness, which leads me to my next two-pronged question. Why is youth activism important, and how can adults support youth activists or advocates? I'll send this over to Kawika first.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about the scrutiny around the effectiveness of youth activism. And that's something that I think, you know, in terms of who's giving that scrutiny, I'm part of it as well. I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on, and this goes into a little bit of theory around campaigns and making change. But I think a lot of youth activism has been a part of a mobilization technique and getting people to come out and you know, getting them, hey, you know, you should join this. But largely, it's always been the same group of people that have been getting involved and been going to protest and testifying. It's always kind of been that same group of people. And if you go to the Capitol, right now we're in City Council and you go to the live stream, you're gonna see it's a lot of the same people that are giving that testimony that all the council members know by name. And so I really think that, you know, as we move forward in pursuing this kind of subsection of advocacy, that we look into bigger and deeper organizing techniques that not only mobilize a whole bunch of people to go and do something, but also reach into communities, find organic leaders and get them at the forefront of the action. And these are people that don't have that experience, that don't have that skill set that was previously acquired, but are people that people naturally go to learn more, and bringing them to the forefront of the action so that we get a bigger, more diverse group of leadership that can make, I think, change a lot more effective and a lot faster. And so, you know, going onto the question of why youth activism is important is, I think, even beyond just the organizing technique, the pure mobilization that has happened this past year, I think, going specifically into climate, you know, 300,000 people in New York, and I think 10 million worldwide in September went out to protest. And now, you know, this is one of the biggest political issues, whereas 5 years ago, nobody really cared about climate change. And I think the youth portion has played a large role in that, especially with the work of Greta Thunberg, Isra Hirsi, Alexandria Villaseñor on the continent. And so I think that that's what's been able to get politicians to really put climate change at the forefront of their agendas. I mean, we're looking at Joe Biden right now. He just came out with a new plan from, as it was advised by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This new plan really destroys what Biden held previously, and it's because youth activists got together and they forced him to make this change if he wants their political support. And so it's been a really great tool that can be used. But I do think that if we approach different techniques, we can make it even more effective. And that's where I think adults come in. Adults are the ones that really have the expertise and the experience in these fields, such as, you know, labor union organizers or people even in churches that do coalitions. I think we can really learn a lot from them, and they just have to be able to extend their resources out to us so that we can learn more about deep organizing and about creating broad coalitions of people that really want to get together and cause change, not only with established leaders and communities, but just regular people that have shown a great amount of interest and dedication to the cause.
Yeah, thanks. I loved your point about peer mobilization. So we're going to send this over to Joseph. What are your thoughts on its importance and means of support in terms of youth activism?
Much like Kawika has said, we're seeing youth engage as social, political, and even economic actors, demonstrating their capacity to develop real social change. Youth activism is important because we're really tackling issues that are pertinent to us all, from climate change to racial equity through Nikkya to even walkability around schools. We're seeing that youth aren't just loud, they're positively disruptive. And they're disruptive in the legislative process, and equally as important, sort of this culture shift that we've been seeing in recognizing that youth can create change. We're participating in volunteer service days, founding sustainability clubs, and testifying before elected officials. But then again, as echoing Kawika's statements, we're seeing the same youth do the same things in the same spaces. So adults can really support by, again, recognizing that there's so much wisdom, gifts, and talents that adults can bring to the table, that adult allies can bring to the table, and just recognizing in terms of adults supporting youth that if we were to find the right adult partners, that we can really elevate the capacity for more youth to become civically engaged, getting youth on boards, incorporating them into organizational leadership, educating them, mentoring youth to understand policy, programming, operations, because we can tell that youth are becoming really important actors in our society and are creating social change, is finding the right adult allies to partner with so that we can continue building that capacity, so that when you become leaders, when you become adults, that you're far more prepared than previous generations were. I was recently on a call with the San Francisco Youth Commission, and one of the members noted that through the commission, some commissioners, as they got older into their late 20s, early 30s, became actual elected public officials. that's really powerful, because it shows that if you start early in the youth years, 14 to early 20s, that you can create these wonderfully impactful leaders. And so that's how adults can support, and why youth activism is important.
Yeah, I like that point about education and teaching kids about, all of the issues that are going on in society right now, to mobilize them to become advocates, for our generation. So finally, let's send this over to Nikkya. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, similar to what Kawika and Joseph said, youth activism, especially within the Black Lives Matter community or just civil rights in general, youth activism has played a very, very large role in the organizing. I mean, Generation Z has been at the forefront of a lot of protests, have been at the forefront of talking with legislators. And it's so important to allow these people to have the platform, because of course, they are the people that are going to be our future. They are the people that are going to be running our government and our legislation. So there should not be a pushback when youth want to be involved in something that they're of course going to take roles, official roles, that in the future. Just by allowing teens to have that platform and get that experience, of course, like what Kawika said, through mentorship or education, just by allowing them to have those roles, you're allowing them to push at legislators and actually get things moved. Because of course, like previous things, I mean, youth have played a huge role in being able to pass legislation and have played a huge role in being able to have a voice, because like they were saying, we're seeing the same exact people that are coming to these Congress buildings, the same, hearing the same exact testimony. And of course, if you're hearing that over and over again, you're hearing the same exact stories, it doesn't have as much weight as if you're having new, younger people coming out and actually speaking out and saying, hey, I'm affected by this too. I also believe that this is something that should be pushed. And that's what a lot of legislators are looking at recently, seeing the big numbers and seeing the amount of support that's happening with the climate change movement or youth commissions or Black Lives Matter. They're seeing how much support and how much it means to the youth. And that's why things are suddenly, finally getting changed, just like when they passed HB 285, all these other things that are across the continent and in every state. You're really seeing that just because of the amount of numbers and mobilizing of youth. And the amount of youth that are within our country, it's so large, which is why it's so important to have them at the forefront of these movements, because the only way that we can get legislation passed, honestly, is with numbers. Numbers are really, really important when you're trying to talk to legislation at all, because these movements in the past haven't been able to have as much traction because we haven't seen as much support. But by opening up the doors to youth and allowing them to also have a platform to speak, similar to this panel here, you're allowing for other people to see, like, every generation is behind this, every generation wants to see this. And of course, since we are our future voters, of course, like half of Gen Z can now vote, you're seeing that legislation actually wants to cater to us because we will be a large voting circle. And if they want us to vote for certain politicians, or they want Gen Z or even millennial vote, they have to put us and allow us to be in those platforms and spaces to speak out. So I would just suggest for adults to amplify youth voices, especially in spaces where youth want to organize. It's really easy to talk over a teenager because they are new. But of course, they can't learn without your guidance or your mentorship. So just be there for them and not always feel like you have to take a leadership role, and allow them to step into that spotlight so that they can learn and that they can eventually learn the skills that they will eventually need if they want to successfully run our country.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would be an understatement to say that youth activism and all of these movements surrounding youth advocates has revolutionized political discourse as we know it. And it's changing the way that people view, mainly our politicians, the way that we view all of these issues and how they impact members of our community, specifically the youth. So for our final question, we're going to be looking at these movements and projecting it towards the future, which I will direct to Joseph first. In terms of your advocacy for Resolution 19-329, what's next? Where do you take it from here? And how do you take a movement and create real change?
Great question. Well, since the Youth Commission is being voted on today, which we think will pass, it will end up as a ballot measure come this general election in the mid-October to early November. So we're excited to launch a youthforoahu.org website, which will basically have the campaign laid out. And we're still creating content, but in the meantime, for the participants here, feel free to fill out the Keep Me Updated form, so that we can add you or our organization to our ongoing campaign material. You can also email me and fellow youth advocates here regarding the Youth Commission. And again, if you want to take this movement and create real lasting change, you're going to have to further this conversation about youth capacity building and youth civic engagement, asking the right questions. And again, reiterating the fact that we need adult allies need to create more avenues to better incorporate youth, workshops, having youth create op-ed pieces, blog posts, volunteering in different roles, and creating mentoring programs. No matter what you do, young voices and perspectives are always important. Sometimes looking through that different lens of the youth is so critical. And I want people to be open to that. And this campaign is merely a jumping point for our communities and for really our nation to recognize that youth play a really important role, and more than important, impactful role in our country, in our state, and for future generations. So again, go to youthforoahu.org where there's more information, and mahalo.
Yeah. So how about you, Nikkya? After the Black Lives Matter protest you helped to organize, what's next for your movement?
Well, currently right now, we were looking at different legislation to get behind, but of course, because session is almost over for the year, that makes it a little harder to want to advocate for a specific bill just on a state level. But that does not mean that we can't still advocate on a city level. We can't still host protests and do other marches and different things to still show support for the movement. It's really important to continue to talk and have important conversations with people in a movement like this, because similar to what happened in 2016, this isn't a new movement. Black Lives Matter has been going on for years, but it starts to die down eventually, just because we're not constantly doing things. And that's why it's so important to still be willing to host events, even if there's not a possible way for legislation to pass new bills, because of course they still open back up next year, and a lot of change still needs to happen. I think what's important in a movement is to really get talking with local or just organizers in general. I think one of the main reasons why the Black Lives Matter movement didn't last in 2016 is just because we weren't organized. We didn't have one set goal. And now that we have the 8, I forgot what it is, 8 to abolish, and then the 8 to the amendments bill, plans. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement can really continue pushing forward this year and actually go to change nationally or just on a local level. But it's really important to not get discouraged just because bills aren't necessarily passing or we're not getting justice for everyone, because we have to think realistic here, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. There is a lot to be done, and we can't always feel like we have to quit just because we don't get everything. But what is important is to continue the momentum and realize that this year should not be the end of our movement, that the week that we did our march was not Black Lives Matter Spirit Week, and that we have to continue advocating for things, and we have to continue talking to our legislators even when they're out of session, and continue talking with other people about what's next for the movement and what we're all going to do in a united front, so that the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't dissolve like it did in 2016.
All right, Nikkya, I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question. So just about, I guess, maintaining the vigor of the Black Lives Matter movement, are there any local elections that any of us should be concerned about or look into, I guess, to keep pushing forward that agenda for the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, even though people usually think to value our national elections, of course, with our president, local elections here are just as important. We have our prosecuting attorney coming up. That's a super, super important election when you're looking at law enforcement and you're looking at changes within a justice system in your community. That's definitely something that you should be voting in, definitely something that the candidates that you should be looking at. We also have the Speaker of the House and those other elections that are coming up. Just value your local elections just as much as your national ones, because your local elections are what are going to get change in your community. And because Hawaii is a lot different than what it is on the mainland, it's really important to have these local elections, because our bill system and our police force and all of these other things are different than our other one. I mean, the bill just passed yesterday so that we can get transparency through our police station, whereas everyone on the continent already had these bills passed. So I think voting, of course, when I said the prosecuting attorney and voting for our legislators and all these other things are super, super important, and that is coming up this year.
All right, and last but not least, Kawika, what are your next steps for the climate movement?
Yeah, before I get to that, Nikkya didn't mention their names, and I think because she wanted to, be nice about it. Here's who you should vote for. Prosecuting attorney, Jackie Esser. All right, that's important. Not perfect, but Jackie Esser is the only person who's actually been a public defender, the only one of very few candidates that actually believes systemic racism is real and is actually offering legitimate, true and tested solutions that will actually create real change. Next, Speaker of the House. There's one person running who is a complete sleeper, which means that may not seem like she's gonna win, but she's gonna win. All right, that's Kim Koko Iwamoto. All right, so Kim Koko Iwamoto, if you live in town by Kinao Street, that kind of area, you vote for Kim Koko Iwamoto. It'll be on your ballot when it comes in your mail if you're registered at a Democratic primary. Jackie Esser, Kim Koko Iwamoto. If you live in other districts, Becky Gardner. Other people, Kawi Pratakino. These are all people that you guys got to vote for if you really want real progressive change to happen in your state legislature and by extension, the rest of the country. Now I did say, and this is going to lead into the question, I did say the rest of the country, and why did I say that? The reason why is because in 2015, the state had passed a mandate for renewable energy. The renewable energy mandate was that by 2045, it would be 100% renewable energy. No more coal, no more fossil fuels, 100% renewable energy. And ever since then, several other states have taken that lead and they've run with it. States like California, I think even Nevada had worked on this, and a couple other states. And so there's, I think, this notion in a regular voter's mind that, working at the state level, convincing politicians at the state level only affects that state. And that's true to some extent, but the reality of it is that if we're passing different things in states, that makes it easier to create outlines for change on the national level. Because one, other states are going to follow that lead if it works out. And two, national congressional leaders and national executive leaders are going to, take that as reason to try and pass that on a national scale. Just like marijuana legalization in Colorado had led to several other states doing it and it being a real talking point at the national stage. But anyways, so where do you take it from here and how do you take a movement and create real change? Looking, like two words that I like to think about and that are follow through. So think of it this way. You can organize 1,000 protests and you can mobilize millions of people. But if there's no follow through at the end of that, if there's no real goal at the end of it, really what you just did was create a really nice party for a lot of people. And so it becomes super important that, when you plan out your protests and when you plan out your other events, you have to think about what is the end goal of what we're even trying to do. So for example, I had organized a protest on September 20th in the state, and we had about maybe 2,500 people statewide, 1,500 at the Capitol. And we had specific legislative goals that we wanted to achieve. One of them was Bill 40, and the other one was Bill 25. We would use the energy built from this in order to pass those two other bills. And we passed Bill 40, which ended up becoming, it's a city and county mandate, but it ended up becoming the strongest plastic ban in the country. Passed that in November, December. And then we passed Bill 25 last month. And so it's important that in order to create real change, you have to have goals set in mind for the movements that you're building. Because without that proper piece of foundation, the movement will only survive as long as people are interested in it. But if you have an end goal to get to, people are going to keep striving to hit that, and they're going to use the energy developed from those protests, from those community events, from those really nice actions, and turn that into energy to create change. But yeah, in terms of what we have next for the organizations I'm involved in, particularly HYCC, the Hawaii Youth Climate Coalition, we are working on endorsing candidates right now. We're in the middle of it, so I can't talk too much, but after we endorse candidates, we're working on legislative things that we want to achieve next year. I think particularly one that I'm excited for is figuring out carbon taxing. Carbon tax is very capitalist, very money focused type thing, and when the revolution comes and we all become socialists or communists, it's not going to matter too much. But for right now, and in the space that we're in, it's important to think about how we can reduce carbon as much as possible. And I think a carbon tax can not only be a really interesting solution for Hawaii specifically, but it can also be a blueprint for how other states want to attack it as they pass it.
Yeah. So we were talking about local elections, right? And following through. I think one of the best ways that people can follow through is to, number one, register to vote and actually vote when it comes to election day. So I want to ask a follow-up question to Joseph, because I know that you're, I guess, involved in this idea of civic engagement and getting kids to just be involved in the realm of politics, to understand what's going on and to get educated. And do you personally think that when it comes to civic engagement, do you think that getting kids to learn about these issues and getting them involved will help to, I guess, increase those voting turnout numbers?
Oh, absolutely. And we see from the data that Honolulu's youth voting turnout is historically one of the lowest in the nations, and it's a complete tragedy. At the same time, it's our fault. It's realizing that we have a city of 1 million people with tens of thousands of youth, but we haven't formally given them enough opportunities to formally engage in our civic process and our legislative process. I think it's so important for our adult allies, whether that's legislators or leaders of organizations, to include them in the policymaking and legislative process. I mean, just starting them young, even though a lot of youth outside of this core group of youth advocates aren't exactly too educated in this process, just getting them started is so important. Again, I mentioned the mentoring sort of program that a lot of organizations and in our city council should adopt. And I stand by that 110%. I mean, having adult allies with that experience, with that wisdom, who know exactly what to do, what to say, and then placing that knowledge upon youth who want to have it. And as we can see here, that there's definitely a need for youth who want to become civically engaged. And so going forward, just beginning that conversation, that dialogue of including youth in any way. I mean, we don't necessarily need to go as far as having youth, become CEOs and whatnot, but that's up to them. What I want to focus on is just getting them started, getting them off the ground, hosting workshops, webinars, summits that teach how a bill becomes a law, how to draft testimony and whatnot. And it's so important. So thank you for asking that.
And since I asked Nikaya and Joseph the follow-up questions, I'll target this last one over to Kawika. So in terms of, voter turnout, why do you think that youth voting is incredibly important to our democracy?
Yes. Sorry, I reset the position on my mic because my friend had texted me saying that it was really loud. So I hope you guys can hear me and that the audio is okay. So the reason I think there's a strategic side to why you should vote, and that's because when we put out campaigns that are youth-led and we say that this is something that we really want, but the youth voting block of 18 to 29 isn't voting, it just makes it easier for politicians to say, that sounds cool, but nothing's bad gonna happen to me if I don't do it, so you know what, I'm not gonna do it. So that is a strategic standpoint, is that we need youth to vote, and so that the demands and the causes that we're passionate about actually have teeth to them, that they have repercussions to them if our demands aren't met. The other side of it comes into figuring out, really it's we talk a lot about how a lot of the systems that we live in, whether it's the justice system or whether it's the way that we pass laws, are very slanted against youth. For example, when we talk about the times that you get to testify in person at the state capitol, when we used to be able to do that, those would be put at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 3 p.m., times when people were still in school. And that's been a large talking point about, why a lot of youth can't participate in the system. But it becomes a catch-22 when the only way that we can get that to happen is when we have politicians that care about youth input and youth engagement. And we can't do that if we're not showing that we actually care at the ballot box. It's incredibly important that youth vote as much as possible, so that we have strategic legitimacy, and that it shows that we care really about the issues that we say we do. And it allows the government to be more representative of youth, because the people that are being put in office are people that have been put there because of youth votes. And so they will be more representative of, I think, the voting bloc that has been so largely underrepresented historically.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks to all three of you. Now we'll be moving over to a Q&A session based on questions we've received in the chat. I will also be inserting myself as one of the answerers, so I'll send this back over to Stephanie.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing all of that information. So the first question that we have is, how do adult mentors find youth activists here on Maui or in general? There are adults that want to support youth like you. How do they connect? How do they connect with you?
I can take it. I will link our website for HYCC for anybody that's interested in environmental work. I will link that in the chat, and then you guys can go to the website and there's a contact section for if you needed to reach out. The other thing that I would recommend is maybe not necessarily youth, but looking into organizations, and this is a little sketch, but looking on Facebook and looking on maybe legitimate websites that are put out like .orgs with local organizations that you can get involved in, because more likely than not, they probably have other youth volunteers with them, youth interns, or even youth staff that you can get into and connect with to find even more resources for things that you're passionate about. So I recommend going to my website, and then I can, if you're not being interested in environment, but you're interested in other things, I can also help with that. But primarily it's just reaching out, taking the uncomfortable step of talking to strangers, and showing your interest in these things so that they can help you and assist you that way.
Yeah, to add on to Kawika's point, it's so important, the power of social media. That's honestly where a lot of youth have been organizing. The majority of the time, organizing has been on Instagram, has been on Facebook, has been on Twitter. So if you're interested in reaching out to youth organizers, honestly, the best way to go about it is looking at social media. That is where the majority of organizing has been happening for not only our movement, not only for any other movements, but it's just been happening for teens that are wanting to get involved in general. They're on social media looking at stuff in their communities and looking at things that people are posting. So reaching out on social media is honestly one of the good ways to get in contact with youth, because that's how we got in contact with other youth for our movement.
I'll add one more thing. Personally, shout out to Kawika and Kaya for those wonderful answers. We've been doing a lot of work personally with Resolution 19-329, and we've been doing a lot of sort of stakeholder outreach, and every group we talk to has insights about different youth councils, youth advisory committees that these organizations have, and they're really helping us make a lot of connections, not only in Honolulu, but to the outer islands. We recently met with Aloha United Way and the Department of Education. I'm sure just reaching out to them that you really want to engage youth in this way, that all of these organizations have some sort of youth leadership board, and I'm sure they'll be super stoked about having more civic engagement work to do and follow through on.
Thank you. The next question we have is for Kawika. Do you have any opportunities for youth to get involved this summer?
Yes. Yeah, like we're actually working on restructuring our website so the application process is a little smoother. But if you guys reach out in the contact section of, again, the hycc.org, and you want to learn more about not only just like, the environment and climate change and, global warming and the science of it, but also about the equity aspect and how communities interact with each other and how that affects climate change, the hycc.org, and we'll take you under our wing and we'll talk story and learn more about actually creating changes in our communities. So I'd go on that website, contact me, and then I'll send you the application stuff once it's all finalized. We get that done. Oh, sorry. Can I add a little bit more? there's a great organization, there is a great organization called the Blue Planet Foundation that does work a lot with youth, and they're having cohorts right now about learning community organizing and learning leaders and meeting leaders in the community that if you're more interested in kind of being a program participant, that's a really great program too called the Climate Crew. And I'll link their website as well.
Thank you, Kawika. Next question is for Nikkya. This might sound dumb, but I'm not Black, so how can I support or get involved with Hawaii for Black Lives?
So just the Black Lives Matter movement in general, but specifically for us, all of the organizers which are in our movement are not all Black. We have a lot of locals and white people. Like, it's not a movement that's supposed to be solely for Black people. I would honestly encourage people that are doing that to reach out to other people, because we need as much support as possible. The only thing with being just by POC in a movement, something like this, is important to know whether to take a leadership role or a place where you're platforming and amplifying. And I think that that'd be the best suggestion for people that aren't necessarily Black or aren't necessarily directly affected by these issues. I think it's really important to take a role of being the person that's like, what do you need me to do? Instead of taking a leader role in these movements. Because this movement is directly involved with the media. So I think it's really important to allow the people that are directly affected to this to have control of the narrative and have control over what's next. So I would suggest anyone who's like not by POC or just not Black in general to be willing to take not necessarily a leadership role, but a supporting role, amplifying the voices of Black people within your community, amplifying and platforming the voices of youth within your community, allowing for those people to take the spotlight, allowing for those people to call the shots to make the movements, and you being more of a supporting role in that area, because of course we love outreach. We love people being willing to do stuff, but you just have to find your place. And especially with this movement, it's really important that you're allowing for the people that are directly affected by it to have the leadership roles.
Thank you, Nikkya. Next question is for Josh. If I'm interested in getting involved with the Youth Council, can I sign up now, or do I have to wait until school starts?
Yeah, so I'll just give a brief summary of what the Youth Council fights for. So basically what we're trying to do is ban all flavored tobacco products, including menthol, basically because Hawaii has one of the highest rates of middle school vaping and the second highest rate of high school vaping across the nation, which is deeply destructive statistics that we shouldn't be proud of, basically, as a state. So in terms of joining the Youth Council, you can go to www.hiphi.org/youth. You don't need to sign up in the fall. You don't need to wait. You can sign up now. We're going to have events in the future, September, October, November, January, and March. So you can sign up now. You don't have to wait until the fall. And yeah, just get involved.
Thank you. Next question is for Joseph. What kind of things can youth do to help pass the Honolulu Youth Council ballot measure?
So apart from getting the ballot measure passed, we're also doing a lot of sort of civic engagement capacity building sort of efforts that we're going to start rolling out come this fall in August, September, October. Youth can get involved by really promoting this effort with their parents, with their aunties and uncles, with adult allies, really. Just sort of, again, beginning that conversation around youth civic engagement and youth leaders, and recognizing that youth are really taking on these pivotal and impactful roles. If you're not registered to vote, please register to vote. And if you are of age and are registered to vote, it's the ballot measure is being heard today. And if it passes, it's going to be on the actual ballot come this fall. And so, again, promoting this effort and the website to adult allies, making sure that they vote yes come this fall. And again, beginning that sort of conversation about ways to include youth. And for the youth, just reaching out to different organizations and adult leaders that they look up to and asking them, hey, what roles can I take on as a youth? How can I begin this process of becoming a leader such as blah, blah, and blah, blah, blah. So yes. Reaching out to adult allies, voting yes on the ballot measure come this fall, engaging in the rolling out of capacity building efforts that we're going to have that will be mentioned later on our social medias and whatnot. So again, all of these different forms of engagement that we hope will include a lot of youth in our campaign. So yes.
Thank you. Next question is for Josh. Can multiple students from the same school get involved with the Youth Council?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So there's no cap on how many students from a certain school can join the Youth Council. I know at my school, there's, I think, about 3 members that are from it. So there's no cap. Yeah.
Thank you. So this next question is for any or all of you, and feel free for all of you to answer this question. So it's, what are some of the biggest challenges your campaigns are facing, and how are you innovating to overcome these challenges?
I'll speak. Sorry. I'm sure this is true for everyone, and of course it is true. There's a pandemic going on. COVID-19 is really restricting our efforts to engage physically with a lot of our participants and followers and supporters. But at the same time, I feel like we're all innovating in the sense that we can utilize these digital meeting platforms to reach people that we couldn't reach before. I mean, we're having meetings with whomever and whoever we want, because there are no barriers between when and where to meet, because it's all online. So innovating in the sense that we're able to reach more people than before, because we don't necessarily need to be in the same place to organize our campaigns and generate support, create next steps. So yes.
Yeah, agreeing with what Joseph said, of course, there's a pandemic. It's really hard to organize a protest or a march when you have like really big considerations of not getting people sick. I believe we have not been attributed to any COVID cases yet, but of course we don't want to. So I think, like he was saying, it's really been the power of social media, really trying to overcome that. And then additionally, just with the Black Lives Matter movement in general, controlling of the media, controlling of the narrative, that is a really big thing. And that's a really big thing that's just been nationally something that people have been trying to work on, being able to control what's being put out in the media, because of course it's really skewed, and that happens a lot of the times with movements. They are only showing things that they want people to see instead of what's actually happening. You're seeing thousands and thousands of these peaceful protests, and you're seeing all of these people coming together as a community, but it's only being portrayed in the media as something that's violent, as something where it's like teenagers trying to live out their anarchist dreams. And that's just not the case for the majority of the protests that are happening. And one of the ways that we've been trying to overcome that is bringing the media to us. My group specifically has done a lot of interviews, done a lot of media things to be able to control our story and control what's happening specifically here in Hawaii. But additionally, just nationally, that's why I said in the last question directed to me, why it's so important to have BIPOC or just Black people in general being the leaders, so that they have an opportunity to control the narrative. They have the opportunity to control what is going out there and what they want represented among the Black Lives Matter movement. Because just specifically for this one, what goes out to the public is really, really important within Black Lives Matter. That's honestly where a lot of people get a lot of their support. Just specifically for this one, social media and the news. So just controlling the narrative in the media just in general has been honestly like the biggest struggle that just Black Lives Matter has had since 2016.
Yeah, those are two really great points. The pandemic and especially the way the media portrays things, because that's how everybody gets their information. And that's how people who dispel information get their information too. But another big one has been, and this is more on the legislative campaign side of things and getting things passed, has been, what are the different public interests that people have, or that organizations have, that they want to make sure are kept in consideration in politicians' minds. When we were working on Bill 40, which was the plastic ban, there's a lot of feedback is a word I'll use. There's a lot of feedback from the plastics industry and especially local businesses, because they were afraid how it would hurt them economically. On another bill, Bill 25, there was a lot of feedback from the construction industry, and the people that bring up these expensive luxury residential buildings, because they were afraid of what Bill 25 would cost them. And so a lot of it is figuring out what is the best way that we can balance what we want, but also ensure that community stakeholders and individuals in the community are being kept at the forefront of politicians' minds, so that everybody has a fair and equitable outcome with a lot of the things that we want to get done. But also ensuring that we don't use fair and equitable outcome as an excuse for getting nothing done. And so being able to strike that balance in both sections, I think, plays a really big role in how legislation moves forward and how effective we are at passing legislation as well.
Yeah, I think like the other three panelists, the pandemic has kind of hit the Youth Council hard in that we had to cancel one of our largest events due to it. And going off of what Kawika said in terms of special interest groups and the legislative side of our movement, the tobacco industry has actually been, really influential in, I guess, stopping our movement from progressing forward in a productive way. While we got we got the passage of House Bill 2457, which bans all flavored tobacco products through the House. What happened essentially was that because of special interest groups, menthol, which is the product that disproportionately impacts Native Hawaiian communities and is actually more attractive to youth because it's easier to get addicted to that. What essentially happened is that got excluded from the bill and because of special interest groups. And right now we're trying to fight for that re-inclusion. So yeah, definitely the pandemic and special interest groups have been a challenge for our movement.
Thank you, everyone. And this next question definitely goes along with what you've been mentioning about how COVID has really affected all of our lives and the work that we're doing. So can youth organizations help with reducing the spread of COVID-19 in the community? Studies show that the largest increase in positive cases is in the age group 20 to 40 years old.
I can take it. I think that, when we talk about spread and when we're talking about youth leadership, there definitely is a connection, and we have to figure out how can we get these campaigns that we really want to go through and that we really want to be successful with a lot of participation. How can we do that in a way that doesn't threaten, the health and safety of maybe not the young participants, but the elderly people and the immunocompromised people that live at home with them. And so figuring out, we are tech literate, I think, as a generation, and being able to use that knowledge as a way of moving forward to not hurt people. One example was we had a large demonstration planned for Earth Day, April 22, I believe, 2020. And just at the height of COVID during spring break, when they had decided no more school. We had to really reassess and look back, what are the alternatives to doing this that doesn't hurt, the attendees and the attendees' folks and other family and community members. And so, the obvious alternative was do it online, but do it online in a way that's interesting and people still want to go to. And so we had talked with the national leaders of the climate strikes and like 350.org, some other individual leaders, Issa Hersey, and then figuring out, we can still do a live stream, but let's do it interestingly. So let's do a 72-hour nonstop live stream highlighting national organizers and local organizers talking story about climate change. And so that's how we were able to do it. And I think, using the ingenuity that I think our generation has, and keeping equity at the forefront of our minds as we move forward, I think is ultimately what's going to reduce COVID as much as possible. There are times though when we have no choice and we have to mobilize in person, and that's when BLM came about. And so that was about creating connections within communities so that they can provide the safest route going forward. And so with the BLM march, I think Nikkya actually probably want to talk about it, but we just took a lot of COVID precautions in terms of sanitizers and masks and making sure that was free and available to everybody that was in attendance.
Yeah, to go off what Kawika said, we did get a lot of outreach from specifically Corona Care and just a lot of other local people to make sure that everyone had access to a mask and have access to hand sanitizer. And of course, you can't force people to wear a mask, but if it's accessible and if it's encouraged, that's honestly the most that you can do for a specific movement. And I'm glad that the majority of us had on masks, and I'm glad that none of the COVID cases were contributed to our specific movement, but I think it's still important to just make sure that these resources are accessible to our community, because I think that it's not just people that don't want to wear a mask or don't want to use hand sanitizer or don't want to take precautions. I think that for some people, it's that they don't have the resources or they don't have the availability of these things, especially at the height of COVID. It was really hard for honestly anyone to have access to masks or have access to hand sanitizer or have access to these things that were required and necessary for us to not catch a pandemic or not catch the disease in general. So I think just for an organization, I think that they should really, if they can and have the resources to give resources and give materials and such as masks or hand sanitizers, make them accessible to the people that are being involved within your protest or being involved within any event that you're doing, to not necessarily prevent the coronavirus, because of course you can't do that, but of course allow the transmittal rates to go down very, very low so that there is a very, very low chance that anyone within your event, if you have to do an in-person event, make it really, really low chance that they will get the coronavirus. Just make sure you're taking as many precautions, make sure that resources are accessible as possible.
Thank you. I do want to honor everyone's time that is on the webinar today. So I do want to advance the slide to share how you can get connected with the different organizations that were mentioned. But just to wrap up, I wanted to turn it over to you folks one more time. Just give a 1-minute talk about what you'd like to leave with the attendees today.
I can go first. There are very few barriers to making your voice heard, and being cognizant of that fact, and going out there and making the uncomfortable first step is something that I think everybody that's on this call should do. And if you have the connection, the internet connection to be able to join this call, you have the internet connection to be able to email your legislators and get them to pass the legislation that you care about. But yeah, thank you.
I think I'd like to highlight the importance of continuing to stay involved, especially in these things that are happening recently, like just specifically for mine, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think what people should be aware of is important to keep the momentum going. Of course, like what Kawika said, if you have access to this panel, you have access to vote for legislation, you have access to email and send in a testimony. I think it's really important to continue to stay involved, to continue reaching out to people. Of course, we've all seen the power of social media. And even if you can't physically go to an event or physically go to a march, you spreading information, you having talks with your family members to get them more educated, or you educating yourself by listening to a panel, watching movies that are talking about Black people, not only in oppression, but Black people just living their life, or reading books by so many of these important organizers that have just been throughout history. Just continuing to educate yourself and continuing to stay involved within these movements is what's vital for the success of anything to happen or anything to change within our community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that education is definitely one of the most important things when it comes to youth advocacy. You know, learning about all of these issues that are impacting us and why people believe what they do. It's going to be substantial in helping you to understand our world and helping you to gain that passion, like all four of us here on this panel have, to actually do something in the community and drive it forward, and using your voice as one for inspiration and one for truly driving change.
I agree completely with everything that's been said. I mean, one of the largest benefits of the work that I've been doing with this coalition is the partnerships, being able to meet Kawika and members of the Hawaii Youth Climate Coalition, meeting Nikkya through this webinar planning. I mean, we're all supporting each other in various different ways. And I would love to see adult allies too continuing to support in any way, going to these websites, speaking to youth about how they can continue to be engaged. Because whether our interests are different, whether we're focusing on climate justice, racial equity, or whatnot, we need to collaborate and we need to support ally organizations. We can't just work in silos. So this coalition building and what everyone else on this panel has been doing has been so beneficial, because it's recognizing that we're not alone in this fight and we're not alone in any of the issues that we're facing, and recognizing that going forward, becoming stronger and stronger. It's so powerful and so impactful.
Thank you all so much. I want to thank Joshua, Joseph, Kawika, and Nikkya for being with us today. I know personally I am so inspired hearing all of your stories and just hearing your knowledge and enthusiasm for your movements. I do want to note that though HIPHI as a nonprofit organization is unable to endorse candidates, we do encourage all of you to vote. Tomorrow, July 9th, is the deadline to register, and you can visit olvr.hawaii.gov to register. It should only take 2 minutes, and Hawaii is doing their voting all by mail this year. Again, thank you to all the attendees on Zoom. Thank you to the HIPHI staff in the background helping this webinar run smoothly. Reminder that we are still doing our webinars every other week. So our next webinar will be on Wednesday, July 22nd from 1 to 2 p.m. where we will be joined by folks from Hawai'i Green Growth. Again, mahalo for joining us. Mahalo to our panelists and to the attendees. And we hope to see you on the 22nd. Aloha.